page 5, in middle of Ois Daled, page Tes, and we were speaking about on the pasuk Am Zu Ytzarti that the Yidden are called Zu, and we explained their connection with Zu, meaning Zu is a variation of Zeh, is because they are connected with Hashem, who is Zeh. Therefore, they are also called Zeh because that's the only thing. Hashem and Alakus is the only thing that is real. Everything else is dependent on something else, and everything else, the reality is something else. And because of that, Yidden are also called Zeh. And when the Yid withstands any tests, etc., he connects with the Zeh of Hashem. Then we started speaking about that there's the Zeh of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is also called Zeh Ha'ish Moshe. And we started saying that Moshe Rabbeinu Zeh plays a role in this, that he received Zois from Zeh, from Hashem, and gave it to Zu, the Yidden. What is it about Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu is the one that manifests and brings about this connection with the Eibishter. And because he is the one that binds Neshamas with Elikus, therefore he has this connection. He is able to bring down the Zeh and the Zois to the Yidden. Now the Rebbe is going to go on. This is not just Moshe Rabbeinu in the past, but it's also the present Moshe Rabbeinu. So he says again in line 22 in the middle of Ois Daled. So too it's in the extension and expansion of Moshe in every generation, who they are. These are the heads of the thousands of Yidden that in every single generation. And they are the ones that bind Yidden with Hashem's very essence. And they draw down the level of Zeh in the Yidden, that the Yidden are also able to be called by the term Zeh. Like it's explained at length in Tanya, it's even people that are unlearned, even those that sin against or rebel against Talmid Chachamim, meaning the leaders of the generation, the source of their neshamas, their bond, their connection with godliness, the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Beis, is through the head of the thousands of Yidden, like the metaphor of a son that he's drawn down from, and he's bound with the brain of the father through the brain of the son, meaning through the tzaddikim of the generation. When Nimsa comes out, top of page Yud, mitzvahs, through fulfilling Torah mitzvahs, v'ayidei iskashros b'Moshe, and through bonding themselves with Moshe, nasim Yisrael b'chinas zeh. So Yidden reached the level of Zeh. So it's two things really we spoke about. There's the Torah mitzvahs, that's the connection with Hashem, and there's the Moshe Rabbeinu's connection of every generation. Therefore, this cleaving of the Yidden to Hashem, both through standing fast in Torah mitzvahs and through Moshe Rabbeinu, brings them to the level of Zeh. So now the Rebbe is going to focus on the particular form that we use. We don't call the Yidden Zeh, we call them Zu. The only difference is, in meaning, is just that one is the feminine, whereas Zeh is the masculine. So he said, nice, hey, Amram b'china Zeh kvi shebi Yisrael, Nemra v'loshay nekeva amzu. The level of Zeh, the way it says by the Yidden, is said in the feminine. That's why it says amzu instead of amzeh. Will be an explanation of this matter. What's the idea why they're called by the feminine term? See, this bond in Hashem's very essence through Torah, studying fulfillment of mitzvahs. It is dafka specifically and only kasher kiyama Torah of mitzvahs. It's not a result of the person's own knowledge, mind, feeling. Ki, rather, kasher kiyama Torah, it says, because when the the fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs is only out of one's reason, or primarily, or because of one's reason and feelings, afilu hergish de kedusha, even a feeling of holiness. We're not talking about, in other words, some other feelings of arrogance or pride or whatever it is. We're talking about feelings of kedusha, as I'll give an example. In such a state, in such a manner of fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs, he doesn't become bound up with Hashem's essence. If the person's own intellect, if the person's own emotions are involved, there's something other than Hashem's essence that's involved. Like it's explained in Tanya, even a complete tzaddik that serves Hashem with awe and a love of delight, the highest level of ava, he is not completely nullified. Rather, he is a separate entity, and that separate entity is the one that's Yirei Hashem, he is in awe of Hashem, and that entity other than Hashem loves Hashem. That, like the expression is, Yesh Mishayev, there is a Yesh, there's a Metzias, there's someone that is loving. Since by the person there is some type of existence other than Hashem's essence, therefore he cannot truly be bound up with Hashem's essence. Rather, how then will he be bound up? This bound bond with Hashem's essence through Torah, starting fulfillment of mitzvahs, is only when his fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs is not out of reason, understanding, and feeling, and without any ulterior motives. Gam loy pniyas de kedusha, even not ulterior motives in the way of holiness. What does that mean? For example, he can have a motive that the reason why he's learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Why is he invested in Torah mitzvahs? Because that will pull him out. It will extract him from the klippus in his bad state. So those are still involved with self. It's about himself. Ella rather kima Torah mitzvah shaloi b'kabal soil. His fulfillment of Torah mitzvah is completely not about his own self-interest, but it's about accepting the yoke. Behind this means nothing matters to the person that's fulfilling the mitzvahs. All he wants to do is fulfill the supernal will. This expresses itself that his service and fulfillment of mitzvahs is in such a manner the most easiest mitzvahs, quote unquote, and the most severest mitzvahs are the same by him. This means even though there's certain things that by the person they are more lenient, like, meaning it doesn't really matter to him from his perspective, his feelings, his motives, they don't really play such a big role. There are such mitzvahs that by him they are the severest of the severest. He looks at those mitzvahs are going to pull him out of the grave, to pull him out of the lowest level that he finds himself at. Despite the fact that from his personal feelings and perspective, he may feel that way, he fulfills all of them in such a way that the most easiest or the most lenient and the most severe are equal to him. The Rebbe says that the Lashon of Chazal is not that all mitzvahs are equal. He says, that means there's a recognition that there's some mitzvahs that are kal and some mitzvahs that are chomer, some mitzvahs that are lenient, some mitzvahs that are more severe. And yet, despite that personal perspective, the way the Rebbe puts it over here, his Kabbalah's oil overrides all of that, and his commitment and his devotion is equal. How come? Why is his commitment and his devotion equal? Because the service and fulfillment of mitzvahs is not out of his own reason and understanding. It's out of the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And he wants to fulfill the will of above. Because the will of above, there's no difference between the easiest of the easiest to the most severe of the most severe. As it's known, will is distinct and different than all internalized soul powers. All the internalized soul powers, even the power of intellect. It's the most highest and most elevated of the innermost soul powers. There is division of there. For example, an intellect. Even when he fulfills one detail, so then he has this detail. As opposed to will, if he doesn't fulfill even one detail, then the entire idea of will is missing. When it comes to a will, there's one of two ways. Either fulfills all the details of the will, then he fulfills the will, or he doesn't fulfill the entire will, since he's missing one detail, even a small detail, then the entire will is missing. In other words, we're talking here about a will that is beyond seichel, a will that's based on seichel. So I need $500, or I need something done, and part of it was done, or I got some of the money. Okay, some of my will was fulfilled. But when we're dealing with a will that transcends intellect, so then it's either the will is fulfilled or the will is not there. There's no partial. I did not fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin if I only had 3 parshas in tefillin, or 3 sections in tefillin, and not 2, and not 4, I'm sorry. Because the will is specifically this way in every single detail, and the tefillin have to be black, and they have to be square, and all the other halachas of the tefillin. And we don't say, well, so you didn't have square tefillin, but at least you did everything else. No, the will is that in its entirety. Perhaps you could also bring an example of a child. By a child that has a will that's below reason, can be an example and understanding for beyond reason. That a child will a lot of times cry and carry on because he didn't get everything that he wanted, even though the parent tells him, the teacher tells him, but you got half of what you wanted, you got most of what you wanted, what are you going on about? So you didn't get everything. By a child, there's the will without reason. Since there's will without reason, it's either all or it's like getting nothing. Lahavdil, Elf Avdolis, by the Eibishter's will that's beyond intellect, it's also that way. If one detail's missing, so then the whole will is gone. How come? What is it about will that is so necessary that all the details are there, or else there's no will whatsoever? But who the reason for the matter is, because the will is a transcendent power. It's such an elevated makif, it's not bound up with inner matters. Moving for this understood, from the perspective of the supernal will, in the makif has nothing to do with details. Makif is beyond details. So therefore, as an expression and the perspective of Hashem's will, there's no difference between those mitzvahs that are lighter and those mitzvahs that are more severe. So he says on the top of page Yud Beis. Therefore, a person wants to connect with Hashem's will. If the person wants to fulfill Hashem's will, he's not doing it out of logic, he's not doing it out of intellect or some other motives. So then, then it doesn't matter to him if this mitzvah is from the most lenient or the most severe. Because the reason for this is the fulfillment of mitzvahs is not out of reason, it's not out of his knowledge, but rather because he's accepting the yoke of Hashem like a simple servant. Now the Rebbe adds, or he could be doing it, he could be doing it on a higher level, a level of a son that is a servant, which was explained previously in the year of Tafshin Yud Beis in the Bas Elegani Maimer, in the advantage and quality of a son that is a servant versus an ordinary servant. Someone that's only a servant, only fulfills the will of his master. But he doesn't connect with it, he doesn't connect with his master, he doesn't connect with his master's will. He does not sense the will. He does not know the reason for the will. As opposed to the son, that he senses and feels the will, and he knows the reason for the will. Still in all, despite the fact that he senses the will, despite the fact that he feels and realizes the reason for it, that's not his motivation. The only reason he does it is to fulfill the will of his master. So that is even greater than just an ordinary servant that doesn't know anything, he just does it out of the fulfillment of the will. Here he knows, and despite his knowledge, he forgoes that knowledge and that connection or that appreciation that knowledge would give him with all the limitations of that knowledge, and he transcends that and devotes himself entirely to do it completely without any type of self and ego involved. Since Dafka through fulfilling Torah mitzvahs in accepting the yoke, one binds himself with Hashem's essence. Therefore it says Amzu in the feminine instead of Amzeh, despite all the milas that we spoke about earlier with the word Zeh, he chooses to use the feminine form. This means Shekol in Yoni who Yosek Kibel Nekeva, his entire idea is to be a receptacle, to be a Nekeva. And he does his service in accepting the yoke. By Deizem, he becomes the level of Zeh, meaning we're not talking about Zu versus Zeh. It means he can attain that level of the Zehism, whether in the feminine or the masculine, that indicate his bond with Hashem's essence. So now the Rebbe Noizvov is going to put a little bit of a twist on the original pasuk that we began the Maimer with, the pasuk quoted from the Haftorah. This is what the meaning of the pasuk is. Again, different than what we spoke about in the simple meaning. Pirish. This means as follows: Shekol hayisavos Ytzarti, the entire creation, which is what Hashem says, I formed it all, I formed all the worlds, etc. He bishvil amzu is for the sake of this nation. The amzu, and what's the reason for this nation? Who bishvil sheti elos yisaperu, it's for the sake that they should tell over my praises. This means specifically when the service is in the way of amzu in the feminine, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, Azai efshar liyas tilasi saperu ba'ofen hamasim l'fi hakavana al yoina. Then there could be that my praises they will tell in a way that's appropriate and corresponding to the divine intention. What's the issue? If he doesn't have that type of bittul, if he doesn't have that feminine amzum, when his avoid is based on his reason and intellect. It's like someone that when he's standing in the presence of the king, he's making a circle in the air, indicating being a separate entity. Behind this means shagam im hu tzaddik gomer top of Yud Gimel, even if he's a complete tzaddik, he serves Hashem with awe and great love of the light, like we mentioned before. He needs to contemplate and meditate on the fact that he's standing in front of the king. The very service that he's doing, the very fact that he's serving Hashem with this yira, with this ava, that's a state of ego. Yesh mishayev, there's someone over here that loves. Though the ego is not something contrary to a positive. The ego is part of the fact that he loves, because he can only love if there's a metzius of himself to love. Despite that, he's in a state of yesh. So that tzaddik, that's at its greatest level, thinks into that he's a yesh. So therefore his avodah is like someone making this signal in the air in front of the king. There's an ego in front of the king, which the Gemara speaks about. A person is liable to have his life taken because it's not the respect for the king. Only when the service is in the way of accepting the yoke of heaven. Amzu, the feminine level of zeh. Through that he binds himself with Hashem's essence, the level of zeh. Then he's relating and telling over the praise of the Eibishter in the way that's appropriate according to the divine purpose. So the Rebbe goes further and analyzes another expression of the pasuk. It says amzu. Why specifically am? Because of amzu, amdaike. Why does he use the word am specifically? Though the word am indicates a low level, because like it says whatever Moshe Rabbeinu, kishiches amcha, your nation messed up when it came to the Cheta Egel. And also Chassidus always speaks about amis and the word gecholim oimimois, the extinguished coals. So why would he use such a low level when he wants to talk about this bond with Hashem? Through the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, the level of Zu, also on the level of Am, becomes the bond with Hashem's essence. Through that, they become a level of Zem. So despite the Amness, they could reach that. So he gives an example from something we mentioned before. The idea behind this is the though all the Nevi'im, we said, when they said Nevuah, they only said like this, and not the word Zeh, not like Moshe Rabbeinu. This differentiation between all other Nevi'im and Moshe Rabbeinu is when we're talking about levels. That through the levels, the different levels of the Nevi'im, all they can attain is only the levels of Hashem, revelations and lights. And from that perspective, even the level of Nevi'im, that the Spirit of Hashem spoke in them, and His word is on their tongue, is only a level of like this. But through the avoid of accepting the yoke of heaven, that through that becomes the bond with Hashem's very essence. that's higher than any types of lights or revelations. It's Hashem's essence himself. Even the lowest level, the level of a nation, Nasim top of page Vidal, Amzu, they become the level of Zeh, which is the Amzu. The reason for that is because of the perspective of Kabbalah's oil, the greatest person of the greatest, and the most ordinary of the ordinary, and Bishav are equal. Just like in a person's service of Kabbalah's oil, the avoida is of the most simple mitzvahs and the most severe mitzvahs are equal.